Hi everybody, welcome back to Capricorn Radio and welcome to the Capricorn TV live stream today. And I am super excited to talk to my two returning guests. I haven't had them on the same call before, which is going to be fascinating. And we're going to be focusing today on America's Stonehenge, one of the most fascinating research sites on the planet as we speak. And second to only Göbekli Tepe, perhaps. And today's author, Andrew Collins, will be speaking on maybe a little bit on both. But we're going to have the curator of America's Stonehenge here as well, Dennis Stone. And of course, I'm joined by my guest co-host, Heather Osborn. Heather, are you with me?
I am here. It's great to be here, James.
Oh, this is your territory.
It's my territory.
Again, Heather.
I know, the east coast of the U.S. I don't live that far away.
Yeah, it's all happening in the East Coast. You know, I'm so excited about today's show, Heather. We got two awesome guests. They've been on the show before. Have you been familiar with America's Stonehenge?
Yeah, I have. I've heard about it for several years now, and some of my friends have been there and kept encouraging me, you need to go, you need to go. So I'm really excited about this topic and that it's coming to the fore in the public eye now.
Sure. Well, let's bring on today's guest, Heather. Hi, Dennis. First of all, let's get you on the show. It's great to have you back again, Dennis.
Oh, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on today.
Hi, Dennis.
And let's bring on our good friend, Mr. Andrew Collins. Hi, Andrew. Great to have you back as well, brother.
Yes. Yeah, good to be back here.
Wow. I guess the first thing to focus on is your collaboration, guys. Dennis, Andrew, how did you two guys get together? I know I've spoke to you both before. Andrew, you must be deeply interested in America's Stonehenge. How did you guys connect?
Well, from my point of view, I was on a road tour with my good friends Greg and Laura Little in the States earlier on this year. And we chose to go to the area of New England and look at the prehistoric sites there. And, you know, I made sure that on the agenda was America's Stonehenge. And it was a place which I'd heard about for many years, but in some way was put off by the fact that there are all sorts of odd stories about what it actually was. Some kind of stone structure that was built by Irish monks about 500 AD, a temple for the worship of the god Baal, created by Canaanites, you know, people from the Bible or something like this. And a lot of these ideas actually, in some ways, put me off, and I'm sure put other people off, as to the seriousness of this site. But when I actually got there, I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's an extraordinary megalithic structure that clearly has similarities with similar stone monuments all over the world, everywhere from Göbekli Tepe to stone monuments in Central and Eastern Asia, and even megalithic structures in South America. So it's part of a global structure of monuments which begs explanation and further investigation.
Oh, sure, Andy. And I know you provided an awesome short 15-minute video for today's show. I'm going to tag that for everybody in the YouTube description. Check out Andy's exploration of the site on video. So I'm going to tag that in the YouTube, as I say. But let's bring on Dennis. Dennis, great to have you back on the show. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the site from your dad, Robert, and how the site was acquired and how you became the curator of this monumental architecture.
Oh, well, thank you for having me back on the show. And I saw Andrew's 15-minute video, and I thought it was excellent. And we put a link to it on our website. It was very, very well done. And I first saw Andrew and Hugh Newman and Jim Vieira and the Littles come through the door. I was just standing in our visitor center, and all of a sudden I saw these faces. Some of them I recognized from being on TV, and I said, these people look familiar, but it didn't connect right away. But we're very, very happy to have them visit us this spring, I think it was. And again, the video was very, very well done. But this is an important anniversary date. It was 60 years ago this summer that my dad first heard about this.
Wow.
And it was on a radio talk show, just like we're doing right now. And it was a discussion all about these strange stone structures in southern New Hampshire, about 40 miles north of Boston, that my dad had never heard of. And he lived in the next town over. And he was just amazed that this thing existed right down the street, and they're talking on it on one of New England and Boston's biggest radio station, and had a really big audience. My dad had just got out of the Coast Guard, where he had spent a couple of years doing the Battle of Labrador. He was up, he thought he'd end up in a nice tropical Coast Guard, place, for a couple of years. He ended up with a lot of snow, and actually he was right up not too far from where the Vikings landed. And he always had a love of the ancient past, the Vikings, and where Christopher Columbus landed, and Native Americans. He was always into that, and he had been up there in the early 1950s. It was 10 years later that they actually found that the Vikings had landed at Alonzo Meadow, but he was about 10 years too early. So he was just listening to a radio show, and he was working at AT&T Bell Laboratories as an engineer, and after the show, he was at a barber shop very shortly thereafter, and he was looking at a magazine. It was sitting on a table, and he picked it up and opened it up, and there's a whole story, a feature about the same site. And actually, it was a 3-year-old magazine from 1952, and he asked the barber if he could take it home with him. He goes, "I can't believe this. I just heard about this on the radio." They were at my mom and my dad were at my aunt and uncle's house, and a few other people. They were all playing card games and having a nice time on Saturday night. And my dad put the magazine on the table and said, "Has anybody ever heard of this place?" And my aunt and uncle looked at it and said, "Yeah, we were there back in the 1930s. We used to picnic up there like a lot of people. It was an informal place to go and explore the stone ruins and the caves, and have a picnic lunch." People did that from, I guess, even in the 1800s. So between the radio show and that magazine, my dad really got involved with it. So it was it's an anniversary date this year, actually, this summer. So it's pretty neat.
Oh, wonderful, Dennis. Great to have you back again. I guess let's put the dating on this. We're talking, it's purported to be 4,000 years old, this site. Is that correct, Dennis?
Yeah, that's what we believe the site is from the evidence we have. And so 2000 BC, 4,000 years. It may have been used well before that, at least the hilltop was. Going back several thousand years, we do have a fire pit that dates to about 7,300 years. That's the Middle Archaic time period.
Wow.
And we found a couple other fire pits on top of the hill, and we know that the site was used right through the colonial, post-colonial period, right up to today, where we have it open as a museum. But Native Americans were definitely on the hilltop for sure, and we found a wigwam site that dates around 2,000 years old. We have a glacial cliff shelter with pottery that dates to about the same time period on two different sides of the hill. So we think we have a summer camp and winter camp for the Native Americans. So 4,000 years seems to be the time, though, that the stone structures were built and that the astronomical alignments were used. That's from both astronomical research and radiocarbon datings. So 4,000 seems to be the time period.
It sounds almost like this location is a strategic position through the centuries.
Yeah, I think it was a magnet, this hill. We're about 18 nautical miles, or about 21 statute miles from the Atlantic Ocean. And there is a river that comes up from the ocean. It's the Merrimack River. It's one of the largest rivers in New England. And it goes within 4 miles of our hill. But between our hill and the river, there's a big bend in the river. There's actually swampland, there's brooks and ponds. And some of the geologists we talked to seem to think that back then, about 4,000 years ago, that area could have been navigated. So you could come up within a mile of our site from the southeast direction from the Merrimack River. And on the west side of the hill, we have a Spigot River, which goes right at the bottom of the hill, and that's actually a tributary of the Merrimack River also.
Wow. Andrew, I always blow your trumpet, Andrew, and you're one of my favorite researchers and authors. You're a discoverer, Andrew. I know that about you. I see that in you. When you go to sites, I take notice, Andrew, because you don't just go there because you want to just goof off. You want to get involved and get in there and see what the site is about. And I love your style and the way you break everything down. Andrew, what is your sense of this site from the first time you've gone in there? What do you feel about it? What's the intuition about and the evidence that you see?
Well, I think Dennis is right that there's been a very long period of occupation of the site. I don't think we should see it as just one particular phase of activity or horizon, as the archaeologists would say, because you've got evidence of activity here going back to 5,000 BC in a very area where you have some of the greatest monoliths. I mean, for instance, there is an observation area immediately above the main site from which you can see a number of different standing stones that are placed in the 4 directions to capture the rising or setting of the sun and or the moon at certain dates of the year.
Wow.
But in addition to these, you've also got another large stone marking the position of true north, and thus the position where you would find the pole star in the sky, and another large stone that seems to be a marker for a particular star. It seems possible that it marked the setting of a star in the constellation of Bootes, probably around 2000 BC. However, the fact that you've got fire pits in the same area as this huge monolith and the North Stone tends to suggest that there could have been something going on here in relation to these megalithic structures at this earlier date. In other words, some of the stones predate the chambers and structures and the enclosures and the wells and the different other features that you get within the main site itself, which seem to date probably from around 1500 to 2000 BC. And then you have probably more activity going on right the way down to around, the time of Christ, a couple of thousand years ago, with this wigwam camp that is very much near where the visitor centre is today. And then probably there's a period of inactivity, probably as you get closer and closer towards the historic period, and then, of course, it's rediscovered in the 18th century. It's brought back into, popular, mindset of the local people. It's bought by a local guy, John Pate, who comes there and adds to it. He actually builds a house actually on the site or on one small part of it. But unfortunately, here the problems lie, because archaeologists see the fact that there was a house constructed there in the late 18th, early 19th century, and immediately want to dismiss the entire monument as some kind of colonial construction.
What?
Oh, absolutely. I was even in conversation with archaeologists in the last week who basically, considered that America's Stonehenge was a virtual hoax, that it was just created to just generate some local tourism. These were academics, and that is the attitude of the academic community towards this site. And one of the reasons why Greg Little has put together this video, which features myself and Greg, is to try and draw attention to an incredible and amazing site. It's one of the most exciting prehistoric monuments in the whole of the United States. And I think that, we need to generate, talk and discussion about this site, because it needs to be moved forward now. In many ways, it's remained dormant, but with the discovery of sites like Göbekli Tepe, in southeast Turkey, which in some ways the enclosures resemble quite bizarrely and quite amazingly, that we need to know more how this place, America's Stonehenge, fits into the bigger picture of things.
Sure. Wow, they don't understand English archaeology then, Andy. We've been building on ancient sites. We're living on top of them over here in the UK. It's like commonplace over here since the Roman times.
I know, but as I said, there's just this attitude amongst the scholarly community relating to sites like this and many other prehistoric monuments in the area of New England. There's a number of stone chambers, megalithic dolmens, and structures like this that have a fascinating history and description, which quite clearly were not constructed in the historic period and must therefore be attributed to indigenous peoples that inhabited, this part of the United States, before the time of Columbus.
Sure. Heather, I'm going to let you jump in at this point. Have you got for either host or either guest?
I'm curious in terms of the overall structure. How many actual stone chambers are there? Is there some kind of significance to that number? Because I read somewhere that there are 14 of them. And are they each specifically dedicated to some kind of god or goddess? Because I know there was, the finding of the ball stone and then also the bell inscription. So has there been any evidence uncovered in regard to that also?
I think that one
Well,
should be
there's
for Dennis. Yeah.
yeah, thank you, and Andrew does an excellent, fantastic job of painting a very clear description of America's Stonehenge. He does a great job on that. There are about 30 features on the main site. The main site is about a 1 acre area surrounded by a chain link fence put up in the 1930s. The one chamber that did have inscriptions, there was actually a couple of structures that had inscriptions, but the main one was the chamber in ruins. It's a rectangular shaped structure with 2 stone windows. It has a doorway with a stone lintel. The whole roof has fallen in with the lintel, and that structure's never been fully explored or excavated, and that's a project we hope to begin next month. And we want to
Oh,
remove
wow.
the roof from it. And if it were two stone inscriptions, one was the one you mentioned, the Iberian Punic, that dedicated that
Mhm.
structure to Baal on behalf of the Canaanites. The other one was Libyan, believed to be a Libyan script, but the stone was so eroded, I think also it's partly broken, they couldn't get a full translation. And then that was found in 1967, 64, both of those stones. And at that time, they were hoping to get the roof out of that structure so they could explore it fully, but they didn't have the time, the resources, or the proper equipment to get the 7 to 8 ton stone out of there. In 1967, 3 years later, they found another stone near the entrance of the structure, and that had markings on it, and some people said it looked very similar in style to some of the stones found in Western Europe. Just kind of an artwork kind of a thing, not really a inscription saying anything. So 3 inscriptions were found there, or petroglyphs, and 3 carbon datings were taken from that structure. But there are a number of other structures there. Unfortunately, as Andrew said, the site was disturbed by the Patty family. And they were shoemakers by trade, and he was also a tax collector. He took in the town paupers or poor people for several years during the 1830s, and involved with the Underground Railway, helping slaves running away from the south to the north. And we found a couple pieces of evidence supporting that. But we don't know how many structures there were originally at the site, because it was heavily damaged by not only were the Patty family there, but they had quarrymen up there, people taking stones away for a couple of years, we believe. And so today we may have roughly half of the site remaining. So we don't really have
Wow.
an exact answer for you, I guess, unfortunately,
Right.
So number 14, I'm not sure about that, but we do have about 30 different features on the main site. And then we have 110 acres approximately surrounding that, with the standing stones, quarry sites, the cliff area, and other things we mentioned, including a workshop. And some of the material there came from near Saugus, Massachusetts. It's rhyolite. It's a type of volcanic rock, and that was imported about 30 miles to our site to be used to make stone tools. So the whole hilltop is basically a big artifact. And as Andrew
Wow.
mentioned, it's probably many, many, thousands of years that the site was occupied, possibly off and on. There may have been periods where nothing was done up there, So that was a very good insight by Andrew on that.
Wow. I just want to draw attention. There is another Stonehenge in America. It's in Washington State, and that's not to be confused with this one. That's an actual replica of Stonehenge in stone concrete, I believe. They call that the Mary Hill Stonehenge. But so what we're talking about is on the East Coast. Nearest town is Salem. Is that correct, Dennis?
Yes, it's actually in North Salem, and Salem and North Salem are one town, but we're near this New Hampshire, Massachusetts border, and we're about 40 miles from Boston, approximately. Right up one of the main highways goes right within 4 miles of us. So from Boston, it's less than an hour away, but we are in southern New Hampshire.
Okay, and the site is very active today. You have a visitor center there, and people can come and see this place and philosophize about it. It's open for tourism. Is that correct?
Yes, we're open every day except Thanksgiving and Christmas, and whenever you have a blizzard, we do close it on those days. But we are open in the winter, and we do snowshoeing, so we open up the entire hill for snowshoeing, and that gives people access to the entire hill, including the glacial cliff area where that pottery was found. During the normal season, that area is kind of shut off. We open up the site, and with the astronomical alignments, approximately 20 acres we have open to the public during the non-snowshoeing season.
Wow.
But people do walk all over the hill anyway. I just met a lady out there in the middle of the woods when I was just coming back from the visitor center to my home, and she was off the trail, and she was enjoying it was very pretty up there, so she was enjoying that right near the cliff area. It's a very pretty area, but she was just off the trail, and I asked her if she was lost, and she said, "No, I'm just following this trail." I said, "Well, that will take you back to the building." but it's a pretty good sized area actually.
Sounds like a beautiful compound, Dennis. I guess you've been a lone voice there until the news hit on America's History Unearthed, but I guess it's a sense of duty for you to be the curator of this historic monument, Dennis.
Yeah, I hope my dad's happy. He died about 6 years ago, this coming December, and he was involved, like we were saying, back in the 1950s, and he was always interested, involved with it, and loved the whole thing. And back in the 1980s, both of us began traveling a lot, so we got to go over, to see our beautiful country. We went up to Ireland, we went over to England, Wales, Scotland. We met Dr. Alexander Thom together, and Archibald Thom. But yeah, I feel like, and I hope it passes on to my son. My son's an engineer, just like my dad was, and
Wow.
he has an interest in the site. So he's got other things going on, but he's very interested. And he was on that Scott Walter show too, with the kind of that very strange alignment with Stonehenge, over the summer solstice. That was pretty. If it's a coincidence, it's a very strange coincidence, and if it's not, how did they do it? Would be the question,
Sure.
That was pretty neat.
Let me bring
Yeah,
Andrew back
exactly.
in again. Andrew, what do you sense about the archaeoastronomy? Do you think that's the single most key important factor of the site?
Well, I would say that the archaeoastronomy at America Stonehenge is among the most incredible in the world. I mean, there's a
Wow.
place in Egypt, a site by the name of Nabta Playa. It's in
Yeah.
the Libyan desert. And this is known as a calendar site. I mean, it's basically a stone circle, but there are a large number of outlying stones which mark the risings and settings of certain stars, obviously the positions of the sun as it rises and sets as well. And I would compare America Stonehenge with that. So in other words, I would say that this is a calendar site. I mean, there are other calendar sites, obviously, in the United States, but this one, I mean, it seems to be absolutely unique and is done specifically with megalithic stones. And you can see this quite plainly. And obviously, what Dennis and his father did was to mow down the trees or cut away the trees, so you can actually see very clearly these alignments at the specific times of year, whether it be the sun rising or the sun setting or the moon rising, or indeed, obviously, the positions of the different stars. And I would say that further investigation there will uncover more alignments, probably connected with key stars that would have been important to the Native American tradition. Already there's a connection with Bootes, a constellation in the northern night sky. That's got a connection with Ursa Major, the Great Bear, which, by the way, was a bear both in North America
Wow.
and in large parts of Europe and Asia, suggesting that these are ideas that go back probably before the split between Siberia and Alaska took place about 8,500 BC. In other words, that some of the ideas and traditions that had probably been in North America for many thousands of years are being exacted, being reproduced, being created actually at America Stonehenge. But it would not surprise me if the activity on the site there goes all the way back to the end of the last ice age. There was an awful lot of human activity during the so-called Archaic period, just to the north of there in the White Mountains of North Hampshire, and going into Maine. And it's my intuition, my feeling that these peoples moved south and settled in the area of America Stonehenge. Now, why they would have done this is a matter of debate, but my sense is they must have seen this area as particularly special, whether they had dreams or visions that might have confirmed this, or they came across the veins of quartz that proliferate in this area. I don't know.
Wow.
But it does seem as if quartz was a very important commodity to these people. There is quartz veins in one of the wells going down into the ground at America Stonehenge, and in a stone chamber just to the south of the main site there, centrally positioned in the back wall, of stone blocks which have all been piled up to create this inner chamber, there is a large piece of quartz. Now, this is specifically positioned.
Really?
Yeah, this is not the sort of thing that would have been done if this was a root cellar, which is the official explanation that's given to such monuments by archaeologists.
Incredible.
And what's interesting is that certain other sites, other stone chambers in that area, also feature pieces of quartz in exactly the same position. And as I said, this to me is firm evidence that these structures are pre-Columbian and that are part of basically an unknown culture that we must take to be Native American in origin. But having said that, I think that there's enough here to suggest a connection, a cross-cultural connection with peoples from other regions. Now, whether this is other regions of the Americas, maybe Central or South America. I mean, remember, there's a place called Amazon Stonehenge as well, in what is on the edge of Brazil into French Guiana, which is an incredible megalithic structure, which has may well have had chambers that were similar to that of America's Stonehenge, or whether we're dealing with cross-cultural contact with Europe, or indeed to Eastern or Central Asia, is a matter of debate. Nothing really can be said with absolute certainty. Plus, we've also got the possibility that voyagers, mariners from the Mediterranean world may well have reached this area, like the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians. They may have been trading with the Native American peoples in this region, maybe even coming up the Merrimack River to do this. And they may have arrived at America's Stonehenge and perhaps even claimed it for themselves at some point, which is why you may have these inscriptions mentioning the god Baal found at the site. We don't know. I think that you have to see it as a little bit of a cosmopolitan place. So we must assume that it was probably created by local people, indigenous, Native Americans, but there may well have been an influence, a cross-cultural influence from outside, from other regions, perhaps even from another part of the world.
Wow, Andy, I got to get you over to Ireland here, Andy. I'd love to show you some places. You're describing places that I could just say is the exact same as Ireland. Carrowmore, there's a quartz chamber there where there's a sheet of quartz as a feature wall. We have Seafin Hill in Wicklow, south of Dublin by 30 miles, where all the quartz from Newgrange came from. Again, they have quartz-lined chambers, very like the Isle of Man as well. You're probably familiar with the quartz chamber there. I have no doubt what you're describing here is exactly the same as what we have in Ireland. I've got goosebumps on my arms. I want to go and see America's Stonehenge now. It's calling to me.
What's interesting is that a lot of these ideas are not out there. You find one or two obscure references to the quartz connection with the site and with the other stone chambers in the area, but it's not well known. I think that if it were, then people would start looking at this site seriously. I mean, as I said, even myself, even though I thought this was an intriguing place, that it may well be ancient, I was put off by a lot of the stories that have been generated over the years by it being created by, Irish monks or whatever. And, there are so many confusing ideas coming out of there that in some ways it did put me off, and I'm sure it must do other people as well. But this site needs to be seen as a megalithic structure of the same type as the enclosures at Stonehenge in England, or in Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, or in Asia, or in any other parts of the world. It has to be seen as an arm, an extension of that type of culture. So this is quite exciting, and I think that with all the publicity and the interest that's happening now, I think some good things are going to happen there in the near future.
And to pick up on that, Andy, I mean, think about it this way. I mean, even within the own island of Ireland, we have Carrowmore, 5400 BC, 4800 BC, 2,000 years apart from the other quartz chambers. So they were cross-cultural in their own different epochs. never mind different locations. But even in the British Isles, we know that the megalithic people were traversing by boat, because the same Scottish art is the same as the Newgrange art, is the same as the Maltese art. So the megalithic culture in Europe, they were navigating by boat. They had to get to the different isles to cross cultural those ideas, even within Europe itself. So I don't see it as big a stretch that they were in America as well. Who says that, they may have been persecuted, floods, they may have just left and colonized another part of the globe. They could have just finished up in Newgrange or, Stonehenge here and just migrated on and just set up another camp somewhere in America. And why not? Why not?
Well, migrations are always two-way. I think this is very important to remember that, people want to explore. They also want to exploit sources of raw materials, like gold, pearls, other types of minerals and things like this. And this has been the motivation for people to go into new territories, probably for the last 20,000 years, possibly even more than that. However, obviously, once people reach these places, one of the first things they do is send people home. Or people get homesick or whatever, and they try and make their way back to where they have come from. And this creates this cross-cultural link that continues. And you're talking about the megalithic culture here. Certainly, one of the points of origin of that is Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe, and the so-called pre-pottery Neolithic culture that existed there, possibly by at least 9,000 BC. And very gradually, this culture spread out into Europe, into Central Asia, down into India, even back into places like Egypt, and gradually outwards. And who's to say that they didn't continue to explore once they reached Britain and Ireland? Clearly, it's a case of, well, where do we go now? And they would have probably followed the Northwest Passage, exactly, which would have taken them, through the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, down onto the New England coast, which we certainly know, almost certainly, that the Vikings followed this same route, obviously to reach Newfoundland anyway. But I'm sure the Iberic Celts, megalithic builders, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, many other types of culture and nation were doing exactly the same thing for several thousand years across a period. So we have to look at America's Stonehenge from that perspective as well, and say, well, look, what are the influences here? Are they European? Are they Asian? Are they South American? Are they Central America? A friend of mine was looking at America's Stonehenge a while ago, and he was finding links between, let's say, the oracle chamber there and similar structures that were built by the Olmecs and the Caribs, people in Central America. So there's a possibility of an influence from there as well. So,
wow.
It's a cosmopolitan site, and it's one that goes back several thousand years, possibly even to the end of the last ice age, I would say.
Wow, I'm just so happy you two guys are collaborating now. I think it's a great amalgamation of effort and ideas and research. Dennis, I believe there has been what's called Ogham script. I was actually looking at Ogham script or Ogham script just on the weekend there. There's a few examples of it up around us, and I think there's a misnomer. I want to put this out there because there's a misnomer that Celtic monks created the Ogham script. However, on Ogham script itself, it says that it's an ancient script, that there used to be bark libraries of Ogham script, and it was, going back into pre-Celtic even. Of course, only the stone examples survive. And then the Celtic monks then try to recycle the Ogham script into what's known as the modern Gaelic. So I will say that's probably where the Celtic monk angle comes from, and it's really a misrepresentation of known existing data. But yeah, the Ogham script is even associated with megalithic sites here, which is what I was chasing down in Roscommon in Ireland, that all these megalithic henges in the west of Ireland and Connacht are associated with Ogham script or Ogham script in a megalithic chamber underneath the megalithic henges, going right into what's called the underworld. So we have that there itself. But tell us about the Ogham script that's been found on the site. Has it been deciphered, or is it legible?
Yes, when Dr. Barry Fell visited us back in 1975, he first looked at the stones we had in the building on display that came from the chamber in ruins, and identified one as Iberian Punic. We already mentioned that one, and the Libyan one. And shortly after he visited us, we found a couple more stones in the patty area, actually, on one of the walls. And it was what Barry Fell identified as a Celtic sun symbol. It looks like a tic-tac-toe board, sort of. And we have that on display in our museum today. It's a very small stone, and we just happened to see it in the wall, and he brought it to his attention, and he studied it and said it was a Celtic sun symbol. Also, another inscription was found, too, on the site, and it looks like it, because the Ogham doesn't have vowels in it, so you have to insert a vowel, so it's, I guess, Ogham Consine, they refer to it as. And so it'd be a very old, I guess, pre-vowel, kind of script. And what it has is like a line across and then a line down, and that line down from it means B, and then two more vertical lines next to it. And he inserted the vowel E, so Bel, I guess. And Bel is related to Baal or Baal that the Phoenicians worship, according to Barry Fell. And so he found that stone that said Bel on it, and we found the Celtic sun symbol. And we also found another stone that I think says Bel, and it's still on one of our pathways between the site and the visitor center. And we found that probably around 15 years ago, and it still sits there today. And when the sun's right, you can see the markings on it. And we think it's artificial. We don't think it's natural. But so we have found those three different types of script. And according to Barry Fell, the Phoenicians, of course, came out across the Mediterranean, and they set up 50 trading cities, including, they were in Carthage, is one of the big ones. And then in Spain, Gades or Cadiz was one of the big ones, too. And he felt that it was a melting pot, the Iberian Peninsula. And our script found at our site and in other places in New England, particularly up in Vermont, they have found a lot of Celtic Ogham or Ogham and other types of script up there. But he thought it came from the Iberian Peninsula because of the style of it. And he thought that was a jumping off place to the Americas. That was his theory. We don't know if it's accurate or not. But
Sure.
So we have found Phoenician, Libyan, and Celtic markings on the site.
Incredible. I'm going to come to that copper trading routes as well. We'll come back to that. I'm going to let Heather jump in for a couple of questions if she likes.
Yeah, just curious, picking up on Barry Fell, because he conjectured, didn't he, that William Goodwin, one of the prior owners of the site, had actually realigned the stones and moved the viewing site for the alignment stones. Was it like 30 feet? Did you find that to be true, that assessment was true? And can you really assess very well what William Goodwin had shifted around?
Yeah, very, very good questions. Actually, Barry Fell William B. Goodwin from Hartford, Connecticut, first became aware of our site from a gentleman named Malcolm Pearson, who just passed away at 99 years old just a couple of years ago, right after my dad passed away. And he was introduced to the site, and Goodwin was interested in Vikings. He was, like where Leif Erikson may have landed. He was interested in where did Columbus land down in the Caribbean, in one of his, the first of his 4 voyages. And he actually turned out to be right about that, and he wrote several books. He thought initially when he saw the site, it was so covered with rubble, debris, and brush and trees that he said, maybe this is where the Vikings landed. It changed very quickly, though. He said, no, this is not a Viking settlement. We don't have the sod houses. It's just not a Viking site. So his theory, as Andrew was saying earlier, he thought it was Irish Chaldean monks that built the site. And there may be a little confusion in there with the Ogham, too. But he thought it was Irish Chaldean monks. And in Viking sagas, they always talk about going across Iceland and Greenland into, we know as Canada today, of seeing these white-robed men. Some of the ancient sagas talk about this. And he felt that these Irish Chaldean monks were escaping persecution, from the Vikings. And this was a safe haven over here. And our site was an Irish Chaldean monk monastery. And he was aware of about 12 other sites in New England at the time, 12 to 15, I think it was. Today, we know of about 800 sites from Nova Scotia right through the mid-Atlantic states, and they've been documented and everything. We don't know if they're all related to our site. Some may, in fact, be related to our site. But he thought the site was somewhere between 500 AD and 1000 AD. What he did, though, is he cleaned the site. He had an MIT engineer named Roscoe Whitney, and Roscoe Whitney was the foreman on the project, and he hired some local people to do the work, and he directed the whole thing. And Malcolm Pearson was a professional photographer, so he worked for two different companies down in Massachusetts, and he was their photographer. So he was great. He was a great asset. He photographed everything, aerial and also on the ground, and other sites in New England that they knew about. So we have a very good photographic record of what was there before Goodwin, during Goodwin, and of course after Goodwin. But we also have some photographs from 1920, 15 years before Mr. Goodwin or Mr. Pearson ever came to the site, taken by some people that were up there picnicking. I think we have two nice views of the site taken in 1920. So we can tell, 15 years before, Goodwin came, what it looked like too. But the astronomical viewing platform was where two stone cairns were located, and they diagrammed them, they photographed them. Unfortunately, Mr. Goodwin thought they were beehive chambers and that they were hollow inside, and they were connected to the north end of the oracle chamber, the largest structure still remaining on the site that Andrews talked about. But they were not. They were solid structures, and they were not connected to the to the oracle chamber. He didn't know what their function was, and when they were doing some restoration work, they actually removed those two cairns. And it wasn't until the 1960s that we first got involved with the astronomical research, and it really accelerated during the 1970s. We hired a professional surveyor, and we paid him as we could. We raised funds and paid him to come in starting in 1973 to actually survey the walls and the site. It took about 4 years, and it was mostly because of money. We just didn't have the big funds to do it all at once, so it took about 4 years. And in 1977, they sent that data to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Mass. And the result was they said, well, if your stones were used for astronomical purposes, they would work about 1800 BC plus or minus about 2 centuries. And that kind of agrees with the oldest carbon dating on the main site of 4,000 years old. They identified the astronomical center as being where those two cairns were. So Mr. Goodwin actually destroyed the astronomical center 40 years before we knew what they were. So we put up a wooden platform in 1975 so you can stand at the correct elevation in the correct position. And that's where the cairns were, which it's a shame he took them apart, but they're no longer there.
Right. Wow. That's amazing.
Wow.
Another really interesting feature is the Beltane stone that was discovered in 1975, correct? But it's unusual, isn't it? Because it's got the Roman numerals, but it's not written in the traditional way. It's got the 4 lines at the end instead of the line before the X. So is this kind of helping in some senses date when some of the occupants were at this site, that it's after the Julian calendar was created?
I think so, yeah. Barry Fell, in his book, Chapter 7 is all about America's Stonehenge, and that's correct. 1975, that stone it's a monolith, and it was found toppled over with another monolith that was standing, I think, next to it, on top of it, kind of covering it, and it helped to protect the inscription. It probably would have still been there, but it did shelter it a little bit from the elements. And the number 9 was different than the way, I guess, it was done later. Would have been IX, I think. And it was B11111. That's the way they did it. And he said that was an older way of doing it. So he could kind of date it to a period, I believe. And that date escapes my mind at the moment. But that was a very important find. And we do have an astronomical alignment for May Day, the Beltane alignment. And that stone is about 10 feet. It's like a gigantic arrowhead. And it has toppled. But that's one of the cross-quarter days that we have. We have them for November 1st, August 1st, February 1st, and November 1st. And plus the quarter days, as Andrew was mentioning earlier. But that Beltane stone is in our visitor center, and it is an important stone. Who knows if Barry Fell was accurate on that or not? We just don't know. We'll need more,
Right.
I think, more research and more experts looking at that with an open mind, hopefully.
Right.
Wow, we're describing all the elements that's encoded in megaliths in the European culture here, between the cross-quarter days, Beltane, the quartz, the archaeoastronomy. What about acoustics? Is there any acoustics at any of the chambers on the site, Dennis?
Yes, in fact, the Oracle Chamber that Andrew was mentioning, the largest structure still remaining on the site. Unfortunately, the corpsman we think there was actually bigger buildings just south of that, but it does have a tube, a square tube, or hole through the wall. It runs approximately 8 feet from the Oracle Chamber. It runs west right underneath the sacrificial table, which is a very large bell-shaped stone that weighs about 9,000 pounds and sits on 4 legs. And when Mr. Goodwin came along and they photographed it, they thought it was sitting on the earth. They thought it was just a rock laying on the ground with a neat, because it has a great big rectangular groove on it. But as his work is dug down, they removed approximately 3 feet of dirt. They found it was sitting on legs. And they also discovered a little bit later that oracle tube, it had been plugged on both ends with stones, concealing it. So somebody deliberately concealed that tube. And if you stand inside the oracle chamber and you're facing west through the tube, you're on top of, if you're about 5.5 feet tall, there's a step right below the tube, perfect position. So everything, works. You stand on that, 5.5 foot person approximately, maybe a little bit taller, and you yell and the voice comes out underneath the table. And when I was in Malta, I saw something similar to that in Malta with their oracle holes through the walls, you know. And we went to Delphi in Greece, and they had something similar to that. So I think a lot of ancient, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz kind of thing, and people would watch a ceremony and hear the voice coming out. And you could not tell that the oracle chamber was there. It actually was built, there's a ridge that goes north and south. And Andrew mentioned the North Stone. It kind of, up towards the North Stone, there's actually a ridge, or what they call a sheepback, a bedrock. And it actually goes down in the site. It kind of depresses. But what they did is they continued that by building the oracle chamber, and it looks like a natural ridge. They don't, you're standing on top of this platform looking at the table. You may not ever know there's a chamber below there. It's pretty well concealed. Wow. So it was deliberate, I think. Yeah.
Andrew,
but there are megalithic sites on 5 out of 7 continents. So Andrew was talking about that. 5 out of the 7 continents have megalithic type sites, and we have them here in North America for sure.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, do you think there's perhaps a ritual or shamanistic reason for that oracle chamber?
Yeah. I mean, I think that if I may say so, that the idea of the priest, making the booming voice and, pretending that they're the god, sort of proclaiming, the rite or the initiation completed or whatever. I think in some ways we've been influenced by, sort of classical ideas. However, I think it's much more likely that the sound that would have been made would have been some kind of intoning or chanting, so that somebody actually laying on the slaughter stone would have been, bathed in this sound, this enchantment, this noise that would have come out through it, that would have helped place them in an altered state of consciousness. Because I'm pretty certain that's what the slaughter stone is. I don't think it's necessarily for sacrifices in the way that we would perceive them today. I think it's much more likely that whoever laid on there was sacrificing their body so that they would enter into an altered state of consciousness, and be able to enter into otherworldly realms. Possibly, sure. This is inferred by the presence of so much quartz there. Maybe they believed that they had to go into the underworld, and they had to use the quartz as some kind of gateway. Maybe they believed that the quartz allowed the spirits of the ancestors to manifest. I'm not sure exactly, but I think this is part of a shamanic tradition, one which is, of course, is present amongst Native American peoples anyway, but one we can also associate with cultures all over the world.
Wow, incredible. Just for the first time that I've ever seen, they have a new visitor centre in Carrowmore Megalithic Complex in Sligo, and they mentioned the ritual use of quartz. There was a Swedish archaeologist team that came there to do the research. They've dated it between 46 and 5400 BC, and they found quartz buried with the bones. Whatever they don't, all they do is they mention it very loosely. They have to, because they can't get away from the facts. But they're mentioning that the quartz was a ritual use. Although you can still see the quartz chambers, like I say, above the ground. When they've done the excavations and they found the remains, they've also found quartz buried with the bones, as if to have some sort of a ritual use. So, and it's the first time it's been mentioned. Although it's kind of brushed away, it's given some sort of maybe it's a ritual use. It's like they're locked into this paradigm that they don't want to mention anything rituals or speculation. But I think quartz is the key, and I'm not surprised to see it there. I'm really not.
No, absolutely. And I mean, obviously today we might struggle to try and understand why quartz was so important. But obviously, it has a number of interesting electrical properties, including the piezoelectric effect. You know, the way that obviously, if you apply pressure to it, it will emit, you know, light particles, photons within it. You know, and that in some strange way there may be a relationship between veins of quartz, the stresses and strains of the earth, and the manifestation of strange lights, you know, UFOs, spook lights, spirit lights, which may have helped them, the people in the past decide that the location of America's Stonehenge may have been important. But the idea of using quartz or similar types of minerals is still with us today, with our own use of crystal balls. I mean, obviously crystal balls, you know, are made of rock crystal, or originally they were meant to be. And, you know, you look into them, and the idea is that you see the other world. You see spirits within that other world. And in a way, that's exactly how the ancients would have perceived the quartz. The quartz would have been seen as gateways, portals between this world of the material world in which we lived and the other world that was within dreams and visions, that was spoken about by the shamans, the place where our ancestors came from and would return in death. And that was probably seen to be accessible via minerals such as quartz.
It's incredibly fascinating stuff, guys. I know there's a lot of other chambers on the northeastern continent, up not far in New England, Maine. Do we know anything about them? Is it too early to start linking this up as New England, Maine culture? I don't even know if you guys have been up that and researched the other chambers in the area.
Certainly, I've been to several of them, but I'm sure Dennis has probably been to all of them.
Yeah, yes. Instead of going to Disney World when I was a kid, we went to these chambers, you know, back in the 60s, and my sister and I and my mom and dad took us to these places, you know, but now I can appreciate it. The New England Antiquities Research Association was started by my dad in 1964. They had their 50th anniversary last year. They have a really nice website. They're a nonprofit organization. It's NERA.org, and when you go in there, you can find something like 800 of these sites all over the landscape, from eastern Canada all the way through the mid-Atlantic states, and then because they talk about other sites around the world too. But some of the sites have some resemblances to our site, the way the stonework was done. The chamber in ruins, for instance, is one of the few that I know that it's rectangular, but the corners were corbelled as you go up the corners. It's very unusual. And there's one, I think Calendar One site up in Vermont has a similar feature. So there's a little bit of a link there. Plus the inscriptions are found, like I mentioned, a lot in Vermont. A lot of these, Celtic, Ogham, and, some of the other types of writings are found up there. And they are astronomically aligned. So there may be a relationship, but I don't know that that's conclusive yet, There is a feeling there's a link between them, though.
Wow. I know there was a copper mining expedition up there, and the copper matches the copper that we used in Europe, clearly telling us with there's the signature of the percentage of copper. So such a refined, high content of copper. It could only have come from this region. So we know whoever took the copper out of North America, they shipped it and fed the Bronze Age culture of Europe. Who do we attribute that to? Celts? Phoenicians? I'm not entirely sure. I think definitely there's been trading routes going on there a long time. I think this place was kept secret, and I think that's going out with a reach. But I have no problem believing that. I think if you had a trading route, you would definitely protect it, and you would definitely use it. And I think these guys could traverse by the route that Andrew has pointed, by going up towards the Faroe Islands to Greenland, and then into New England, Maine, and that way. Into the top of North Africa, no problem. I think it was a definite easy route for them.
If any of you familiar with the coin that was found, that was Carthaginian, and it has on the back side, it has what a Mount Holyoke, Holy Cross, I think it is, professor in Massachusetts. Maybe it's Mount Holyoke, I think it is. I forget the gentleman's name, but he looked at it under a magnifying glass or microscope, and it's very, very small. You can't see it with your naked eye too well. But it looks like the western part of the Mediterranean, part of Africa, part of Western Europe, and to the left side, it looks like the peninsula of Florida, part of the eastern seaboard, and the Gulf of Mexico on it. and that's I'm not sure the date of the Carthaginian coin, but it's found overseas. It wasn't found here. Nearer to home, near the mouth of the Merrimack in 2010, a house was going in, and again, the Merrimack would be the river that would be the closest to our site, and they found a Phoenician coin, and that was found, I think, 2010, so 5 years ago. I haven't heard much about it since then, but that's just one of those interesting things they found. Like only about 20 miles from our site, they found that.
Wow. Heather, you want to go in for the last question before I start wrapping things up?
I was just curious to get back to some of the local sites in more the immediate area. In terms of South Woodstock, like you mentioned some of the sites in Vermont, Dennis, and also Upton Chamber, which was owned by Malcolm Pearson. Are there any more direct corollaries to things that are more in the immediate area, like the use of quartz? Has that been identified at all? Or some of the structures that are more similar in the structures in the immediate area with these stone sites?
That's a great question. That quartz, as Andrew was mentioning, is found in many of the chambers. But my dad noticed in the 1960s, and because he got involved with it in the late 50s, but by the 60s, he really started seeing a lot of these cairns that found all over the landscape, these piles of rocks that nobody knows who built. On top of them would be these quartz, these large pieces of quartz right on the top of the cairns. So there was another use of these of quartz. Besides inside the chambers, they were actually in some of these cairns that were found on the landscape. And right in our neighborhood, within about 10 miles, is probably about 10 structures, not too far from our site. And they have large stone roofs. They have no metal tool markings on them indicating historic construction, and no historical record as to what the purpose of these structures are. And there are some similarities in the way the structures are shaped to ours. In fact, the watch house that Andrew mentioned earlier with the quartz in the back wall, there's about 50 of those structures in New England that are very similar, large glacial stone. And if you're looking at it, looking towards the entrance of it, the large glacial stones on the right side, the structure's built around the stone on the left side. And there were about 50 of those in New England. So there's a similarity to that, the way they built it. So there might be a connection there too.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Wow. Andrew, could you take a moment and tell us about because we're going to wrap things up, just give us your website and tell us about the Origins Conference coming up this November, I believe. I think this is one of the most exciting ones you're going to do yet, because you have Graham Hancock speaking, and of course he's got his new book coming out, and I think it's going to be one of the best books of the last 20 years. I'm so excited about this book coming out. I think everybody is. So tell us a little bit about the Origins Conference, Andrew.
Okay, yeah. My website is www.andrewcollins.com, and on there you'll find all the details you need for the upcoming Origins 2015 conference in London, which is on Saturday, November the 7th. Our keynote speaker there is Graham Hancock, whose new book, Magicians of the Gods, is published in September, as you have just alluded to. And this book is going to be a game changer. I mean, whether everything that Graham will write in this book is right or wrong is irrelevant. This is going to change everything. His book is being serialised in a major UK newspaper. It will probably be serialised in other parts of the world. It will have a lot of publicity. There will be a lot of discussion amongst archaeologists, journalists, anthropologists, about what he's saying, and it will generate so much interest in this subject that we all need to be aware that this is coming. And Graham will be talking and delivering a major lecture on the whole subject in November at our conference, Origins 2015, and there are many other good speakers there as well, including via Skype directly from Java, Danny Hillman, the geologist in Java, who's redated the largest megalithic monument of Indonesia there, known as Gunung Padang, from about 600 BC back to pre-8000 BC. Mm-hmm. So he will be talking and how he feels that this fits into the greater picture of what was going on at the end of the last ice age. Obviously, Hugh and myself are there. We've got various other speakers, and of course, we got Jim Vieira. Oh yeah. Now he's the star of the Search for Lost Giants history TV show, He's writing a book with Hugh Newman, which will be published shortly before the conference, and they'll be launching that there as well. So there's a lot going on, and we urge anybody in the ancient mysteries subject, to be there in London on the 7th of November.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be there, Andrew. I can't wait for this one. It's just one of the most exciting conferences this year for sure. Of course, we'll link that up in the YouTube description as well. That'll be on andrewcollins.com. Of course, Dennis, could you take a moment, please, and give us the website for America's Stonehenge too?
Yes, it's stonehengeusa.com, and there's an email address and a phone and the telephone number. If anybody wants to contact us, they can do email or give us a phone call, and we'll be glad to try to answer the questions if we can. And so it's stonehengeusa.com.
Thank you, Dennis, and I really appreciate your efforts and your family's efforts in bringing this site not into just the limelight, but also to preserve it and be the curators of it, because it's you find this all the time throughout history, that it's a family or a group of people that preserve a site until archaeology or the academic institutions get a hold of it and really kind of accept it. And so first of all, I commend you on that too, Dennis, and great to see you two guys as well collaborating, Andrew and Dennis. Really do, it's great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the radio, and thank Andrew, and thank all of you too. Very good questions, and I really appreciate that. And working with Andrew is kind of a dream come true, so that's great.
Sure. Well, listen, guys, I really thank you for the call today. Heather, great to have you here too. What did you think of today's show, Heather?
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah, I can't wait to go there.
Well, you're going to be my guest, so come up anytime.
Oh, great. Thank you, Dennis. I'll bring my husband. We'll come visit. He's an author.
Thank you. That'd be great.
Listen,
thank you.
guys,
Thank you for everything, Dennis and Andrew.
Thank you for the call, guys. I'm going to catch you all soon.
Okay, all the best to everyone.
Thank you.